Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I could ask you to take your seats. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Archives on behalf of the Archivists of the United States. I'm Patrick Madden, the Executive Director of the National Archives Foundation. I can't think of a more befitting venue than the National Archives to host today's program. We're delighted to have such a great crowd for the program. The National Archives Foundation is the private partner to the National Archives, a 501c3 that works to put the fun in the National Archives as the creative and financial support to some of its outreach work, programs like this, exhibitions, and so forth. And so we welcome your participation today. We always invite you, if you're interested in engaging more with the National Archives, we have a membership program. As the archivist likes to say, we've never turned anyone down for application. So please think about that. Before we get to today's program, I want to introduce two public programs that are coming up in conjunction with Women's History Month. Tomorrow, Wednesday, March 7th at noon, we'll have Janine Abrams here to discuss and sign her new book, First Ladies of the Republic, Martha Washington, Abigail Adams, Dolly Madison, and the Creation of an Iconic American Role. And then next week on March 13th at noon, Jessica Zaparo will be here to discuss and sign her book, This Grand Experiment, When Women Entered the Federal Workforce in the Civil War Era in Washington, D.C. So if you have time or interest, you can join us here again, or you can join us on YouTube. I want to welcome all of those who are watching here, whether you're in Texas or Ohio or California. These programs are always national, and if you can't make the exact time, the Archives does a great job of archiving them online so you can watch them at any time. So feel free to catch up on all of your Archives programs on the YouTube channel. Today's program, Democracy's Messengers, is the never-before-told story of young Americans on Capitol Hill. This is going to be a terrific screening. It is the national premiere, worldwide premiere, I've been told as well. So we are delighted to host that here today. Following the screening, we're going to have a panel discussion with three former pages, Frank Mitchel, Jonathan Turley, Camilla Bosanquet, and leading today's program is a friend of the National Archives, one of the film's producers, Gerry Papazian. Now, Gerry is the president of the U.S. Capitol Page Alumni Association. He's currently managing director of Fountainhead Associates. He holds degrees from USC and UCLA. He was a member of the University of Southern California's Board of Trustees, as well as USC's Alumni Association. He is the chairman of the Armenian Film Foundation and a Henry Crown Fellow at the Aspen Institute. He, too, served as a page at the U.S. House of Representatives from 1971 to 1972 under the sponsorship of Barry Goldwater. I have a feeling we might hear a little bit more about that. And to get us started, please welcome the real force behind today's program, Gerry.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you to the National Archives and the National Archives Foundation for hosting us today, and especially to some of the members of the staff, Laura Garay and Tom Nastic, and everyone here who's made this event possible. We're really excited to have this great venue to have our debut, national debut, international debut of Democracy's Messengers. Patrick mentioned that I've also, in addition to producing this film, I wear another hat of being the president of the Capitol Page Alumni Association. And I just want to acknowledge one of our partners, the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. We have as special guest Dot Crosby, who is the daughter of the founder of the Historical Society and former member of Congress, Fred Schwangel. So Dot, thank you for being us, and thank you to the Historical Society for helping us with this program. I just want to mention that tomorrow they are sponsoring a book event of a former Senate page, Marcy Sims, who's here as well. Her book, Capitol Hill Pages, Young Witnesses to 200 Years of History. This was a companion, I'll say a companion book to the film originally. I think it kind of outgrew us. but it dives much deeper into many of the stories that you're going to hear in the film, see in the film today. On behalf of my co-producer, Miles Taylor, and the director, Eric Young, thank you for coming today. In 2011, after the House abruptly terminated its page program, a few of us former pages sought ways to remind our national leaders, our elected leaders, and the general public of the importance of having young people serve in Congress. Frankly, we felt the decision was short-sighted. We thought the best way to communicate this, though, would be through film. And today, what you see today are our efforts to put out those thoughts. So without further ado, I would like to present Democracy's Messengers.
Here you are, Senator. Not a bad desk either. Daniel Webster used to use it.
Daniel Webster sat here?
Give you something to shoot at, Senator, if you figure on doing any talking.
Oh, no, I'm just going to sit around and listen.
That's a way to get reelected. This is the calendar for the day. You'll find the Senate manual in here. Anything else you want? Just snap for a page.
Since the birth of the United States, young Americans have served in the nation's capital, working alongside leaders in the House of Representatives, Senate, and the Supreme Court. Known as pages, these young people have had a front row seat to the most dramatic events in the country's history, from the Revolutionary War to 9/11 and beyond. Having pages on Capitol Hill has not always been easy. Everything from sex scandals to cost and changes in technology have jeopardized these programs that allow future generations to be so closely involved with their government in Washington.
The FBI started investigating. The media had an absolute field day, and of course, there had to be some people take a fall.
Today, pages serve only in the U.S. Senate after the House of Representatives discontinued its program in 2011.
It was devastating to see not just the cancellation of the House Page program, but how little thought and discussion went into it.
The tragedy of the page system is that the pages really never did anything wrong. It was the members of Congress that destroyed the system.
The move has stirred debate about the consequences of allowing a 200-year-old American institution to disappear. This is the coming-of-age story of that tradition and the young people it shaped. Many have become leaders themselves, but until now, their story has been largely untold. The story of the pages began during the American Revolution in the 1770s, when young messengers were first hired to work in the Continental Congress.
The Senate met for the first time March 4th, 1789. So the very first thing it does is to hire a doorkeeper who also served as messenger. And it wasn't until the 1820s that the two houses of Congress decided to start hiring children to do this task.
The 1800s found pages being recruited from local orphanages and later from families of soldiers who died in the Civil War. Members of Congress sponsored these boys, hoping to provide them with education, wages, and hope for a better life.
There are a lot of stories about how members sort of adopted pages and they became a part of their families.
As new states were added to the Union, the number of representatives in Congress increased, and so did the number of pages, from a handful to several dozen.
In some ways, it was similar to what it is today, but in other ways, starkly different. Most of these kids that were pulled off the street lived at home. There was no formal education process at all. And the duties were quite different, just because the nature of the business and technology has changed so much.
During those early days, page duties ranged from refilling inkwells and snuff boxes to sharpening quill pens and even chasing bats out of the congressional chambers.
In the 1890s, electricity comes to the Capitol, and they begin to get things like lights and buzzers that tell members where they have to be and when a vote has been called. Prior to that, if a vote was called, a page would be sent out not only all around the Capitol, but all over Capitol Hill. He would go to boarding houses and hotels and local homes to find members to get them to the chamber to vote.
Every 4 years, pages played a role in presidential elections, a role that continues today.
pages carry the boxes holding the electoral ballots, very secret and very well-guarded boxes, from the Senate over to the House chamber where the official counting happens.
Prior to the 1900s, Congress and the Supreme Court worked pages around the clock, which interfered with their schooling. Public pressure ultimately forced them to adapt, and in the 1920s, a page school was established in the Capitol building.
Every morning we'd wake up really early, 5 or 5:30 or something like that, so that we could be to school by about 6.
They had 5 academic classes, very compressed, very quickly, bam, bam, bam. They went to work, they worked a full adult workday, sometimes more than that. It's a hard, hard life.
Being a page showed me how important government is, especially good government that tries to make our society better.
I learned a lot. It was a very formative experience.
It really opened the door to just a realm of possibilities.
The institutions that we have, that we get to be a part of, that are now hundreds of years old, it's an honor to be a part of that.
There's something to be said for a program that's been around for 200 years.
It was a mountaintop experience in my life.
It opened up a portal into a fascinating world that I would not have experienced otherwise.
Yes, all right, Danny. I see you have this bill here. I sent for this bill, and this is one of the errands that Danny's just he's just finished.
Is he a page?
He's a page, and he's a page that I recommended. He's from my district.
The page programs also grappled with diversity as America legislated an end to discrimination against women and African Americans. A recent discovery by historians has revealed that as early as 1871, an African American teenager named Alfred Q. Powell was appointed as a house page, a milestone well ahead of its time.
Ironically, his first day on the job here was to listen to a debate on the Ku Klux Klan. This was the Reconstruction period when there were a few black congressmen, and they were talking about how difficult it was to live in the South.
But it would be 83 years before another African American would be given the chance to serve. 1954, the Supreme Court handed down its decision on racial segregation with Brown versus the Board of Education and decided to hire its first African American page, Charles Bush, effectively integrating the Capitol Page School.
Charles Bush was the first black person to go to the Capitol Page School, and I followed him the next year. I got called into the principal's office, and Charles Bush was in there as well, and they told us that we had been selected to go to the Supreme Court as pages.
At this point, parts of Washington, D.C. were still segregated. And so there were really two Washingtons. There was the official Washington, and then there was sort of residential Washington, which is where the vast majority of the population lived, who were African Americans. And so I found myself traversing that boundary and living in both communities.
In 1965, Lawrence Bradford became the first African American page in the Senate, followed by Frank Mitchel in the House.
Back then, they didn't have dormitories for the pages. They lived in these boarding houses, and the lady that owned the house opened the door, took one look at us, and said, "No one told me he was a nigger. I don't let niggers in my house," and slammed the door in our faces. I could see my parents felt very hurt, while my congressman got very upset and told me that there's no excuse for this, and he was going to do something about it. But what he did was introduce legislation that said anyone that was providing goods or services to the federal government in exchange for federal dollars could not discriminate. People asked why he was going to those lengths to make a change. Why didn't he just find another boarding house? And as he explained it, it's that it's never the wrong time to do the right thing.
In the 1970s, the page programs finally allowed women to join the ranks of Capitol messengers. Though a congressman's daughter had briefly served as a page in the 1930s, it wasn't until 1971 that the Senate overcame many years of debate and changed the rules barring women. That year, Paulette DeSalle, Ellen McConnell, and Julie Price were sworn in as pages, soon followed by Velda Looper, the first female House page.
In the late 1960s, our family took a vacation to Washington. We went into the House gallery,
and watching what was going on. And I saw these kids, teenagers, down on the floor, and I said to my dad, who are those kids and what are they doing here?
And I read that there were these boys who could be pages. It didn't occur to me that there weren't any girls. I just assumed they happened to snap a picture of a boy.
And he looked at me and he says, well, it's kind of an unspoken rule that they're just boys who are pages. I can remember saying to him very defiantly, that's just not fair.
We circulated a petition about allowing girls to be pages and it not being fair that they couldn't.
And then I got a call from Charlie Ward, who was Mr. Albert's administrative assistant.
I got a call from Senator Harris's legislative aide, and he said we're thinking about appointing a girl. We all have different stories, but we all started working that May.
There's only two sides to this here chamber. What had happened if a third party ever got started?
It's up to us Democrats and Republicans to run this government so well a third party won't be necessary. Come on, I'll show you the ropes.
When I was about 10 years old, I read a story in Boys Life magazine, the Boy Scouts magazine, about pages. And I said, I want to do that. I came from a small town, had been interested and even obsessed with politics since I was a little boy. And when I heard about the page program, it was the kind of revelation that comes only a few times in your life.
As early as about 9 or 10 years old, I started writing letters to the senators from Illinois and also the representative from my district, saying I was interested in being a page.
I read an article in Time magazine about congressional pages. It had the red herring that if you didn't have political horsepower, connections, family with money, your chances of being selected were slim indeed. Actually, most of my classmates got there on their own dime. They were ordinary kids from ordinary families and neighborhoods just like I was.
My father was a clerical worker for the federal government, a part-time auto mechanic. My mother was an entrepreneur with moderate success. My grandfather was a hotel doorman for 41 years, and my paternal grandfather was a janitor in a public school system. So from those beginnings, I got to run a very successful multi-billion-dollar business. I would not have accomplished anywhere near what I've been able to accomplish had it not been for the opportunity and the exposure I got as a page on the Hill.
Imagine the only child of refugee parents who had the opportunity to walk the halls of Congress, to stand on the House floor while the House was in session, to ask questions of the women and men who were making the most important decisions for our country. It really gave me a sense of belonging.
That experience not only instilled but underscored a sense of doing something with a higher purpose, whether that was working on behalf of the government or working for the country or public service journalism, what I'm part of now. There's a direct link between what I do now and what I did when I was 16 years old. And if I didn't do that, there is no doubt in my mind that I wouldn't be doing what I do now.
I realize, of course, that your lives haven't been entirely weighed down by matters of state. For example, you may think I haven't heard about the cafeteria food fights, or the pages caught sleeping in the cloakroom, or the one who winged a congressman with a rubber band. I have, and if you get short of rubber bands, let me know.
Despite long hours, the pages witnessed what most Americans would never have the chance to see: the personalities and behind-the-scenes deal-making of the country's leaders.
It's a chance for people to learn about our government. I see kids going through a tour in the Capitol building, and they point out the statues and a few things. But that experience is nothing compared to actually being part of the legislative process, where somebody will come onto the floor and would ask me, okay, what's going on? Is Representative so-and-so here? And you're reading the Congressional Daily Record and, seeing all the things that are there.
With a fly-on-the-wall perspective, pages were able to witness history being made up close in the nation's capital.
We got to see great things in the history of the country. I saw the declaration of war by President Roosevelt.
December 1941, Pearl Harbor is attacked, and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt famously addresses a joint session of Congress to ask for a declaration of war against Japan.
There was a sense that this was a moment of the utmost gravity. Everybody was very hushed when the president walked in.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
March 1st, 1954, 4 armed Puerto Rican nationalists stormed the House of Representatives, firing guns within the House chamber.
There's a photograph of a couple of pages with a stretcher over their shoulder, and they're pushing people out of the way from when some Puerto Rican nationalists fired down on the House of Representatives and wounded 5 members of Congress.
My husband was the chief page over on the Democratic side at the time, and he was sitting at the desk and all of a sudden started hearing shots fired.
To me, they sounded like firecrackers. And the only realization I had that they were actually bullets was one hit above on a calm. So Bill and I got together and coordinated getting the stretchers, and we literally ushered 3 of the 5 shot members off the floor.
November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy is assassinated.
I was sitting there on the dais the day Kennedy was shot, and Richard Rydell was a doorkeeper, came running, just broke the decorum of the Senate, and he came running up and whispered something into Senator Ted Kennedy's ear, who was presiding. Ted Kennedy was presiding over the Senate at the same time his brother was shot.
I was the senior page serving outside of the conference room of the justices, and the Chief Justice Secretary comes back, with this ashen face and says, President Kennedy's been shot, and we need to get a note into the justices.
In those days, you had the news tickers is how we got everything. And I would spend my lunch hour sometimes just at the news ticker, just reading what came across the wire. And there were all the senators crowded around there. Senator Bartlett from Alaska. I said, here, Senator, you want to get near the ticker? He said, no, this is history, son. And he pushed me up to the front to look over the ticker as it came through.
I went, knocked on the thick wooden door. Arthur Goldberg came to the door. And I remember thinking when I handed him the note, here's a man who's been appointed by President Kennedy, and he's getting this news, and it's terrible, terrible news. They took the note in, Justice White screamed out. That was that.
I was there during the 1990 to 1991 school year. That was the year we went to war in the Persian Gulf, when they were considering whether or not to send troops to Kuwait. There were long nights, and they would look at the pages on the House floor. We were 16 and 17 years old, and the members knew that we were the ones who would respectively go to fight. During the voting, several of them would just stop and stare at us before they cast their vote.
The pages represented the next generation on the floor of the House of Representatives. They were witnesses to legislation that would define their future. They're as important a symbol of Congress as anything else in that building.
September 11th, 2001, terrorists attack the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and target the U.S. Capitol.
The pages are responsible for ringing bells throughout the House complex. So as part of our training as pages, they tell you what all these bells mean. And one of the things that we're taught is that, and there's 12 bells, which is the civil defense warning, which means something bad's really happening, but we've never really had to ring it before. We're watching all this stuff unfold on TV, and our supervisor comes in and says, we have to ring the 12 bells. We're evacuating the Capitol.
None of us really knew what was going to happen next. The kids were all over in the Capitol, and I was going to a meeting. And by the time I got to my meeting over in the Capitol, the plane had hit the Pentagon and everybody was running.
Is this the beginning of a war? Like, are we watching a war begin, And it was just, there's just so many questions running through everyone's head.
The other thing that I very vividly remember is walking down that street and looking back over my shoulder and being like, I may never see that building again. Like, literally, that might blow up. That could be gone.
When I started hearing about how the bravery of those on Flight 93 had probably saved my life and my best friends' lives, I didn't know what to do, frankly. How can you say thank you to people who are already dead? And because their families don't have them anymore, I'm alive, I think about them and the efforts that they made, and the sacrifices they made, at least once a week, even to this day, because I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be spending time with my family, with my friends. I wouldn't have a great job as a Foreign Service officer that I love without their bravery.
Amazingly enough, September 12th, pages got up at their regular time. They put on their uniforms, they came to school, and they went to work. The kids really saw it as they were public servants. So soon in their page time, they were public servants. They were essential employees, and they were not going to drop the ball.
Pages frequently found themselves face to face with some of the most powerful people in the world.
I think it was the first presentation of the State of the Union by Dwight Eisenhower. Between the outside chamber and the inside chamber, there's a little reception room. And that's where whoever goes in there to open the doors sits. So you're alone with the president, basically. And he said, "Young man, can I do something for you?" I said, "Well, I have to confess, I'm just thrilled to be here. I had never imagined that I would have this opportunity to usher you anywhere." He said, "Take a moment and sit down." He said, "I want to tell you something very important. When I get up in the morning, I put my trousers on one leg at a time." And quite frankly, he didn't say it for purposes of humor. He tried to make the point that he's just an ordinary man.
Late June of 1990, Nelson Mandela came to address a joint session of Congress. When I was growing up, we were so connected to the anti-apartheid struggle as African Americans because we had just conquered our own apartheid here in the U.S. So it was better than Michael Jackson. It was better than Michael Jordan. It was better than, Elvis coming to visit.
It was our about second week on the job, and we were in the middle of a roll call vote. And I'm sitting up there on the rostrum taking notes of who's voting and who's not. And then Senator Joe Biden walks in and says, "Come with me, I've got somebody I want you to meet." So I leave my duties as a page, which is probably something I shouldn't have done, but went down and he actually introduced me to the Dalai Lama. Here we were, high school juniors, on the floor of the Capitol, and then all of a sudden we're meeting the Dalai Lama. It was an unbelievable experience.
Like much of Washington, the page programs were not immune to scandal. In the early 1980s, 2 congressmen were censured by the House for engaging in sexual relations with pages. The program was placed on hiatus, and a board was created to ensure the pages were protected from such behavior. But the seeds had been planted for those who would later argue that young people were a liability to Congress.
There had been a handful of scandals in history of members of Congress having inappropriate interactions with the young people in the House, and quite frankly, the leadership was tired of managing that problem.
In 2006, a congressman was accused of sending explicit messages to several former House pages.
There were a number of people who were concerned about Congressman Foley. Some of the supervisors found his interaction with the kids on the House floor weird, for want of a different term. He didn't have any contact with the pages in an immoral way while they were there, but he did send emails to male pages who had left the service of the House.
An investigation was launched, and the congressman resigned. 5 years later, House leaders abruptly announced the end to their page program, citing cost and changes in technology. The decision to end the 200-year-old tradition was made without a vote of the House.
The excuse was made that the $5.5 million that it cost to operate the program was a waste, and that the kids had been replaced by technology. I must believe that the reason was this could happen again, and neither of us needs the problem. If we get rid of the young people, we're not going to have that problem.
The page program itself constituted 1/1000th of 1% of just the legislative branch's budget. So that was sort of a false pretense. The second issue, that technology had gotten rid of the need for pages, was also a false one. If that was true, then the advent of the telegraph meant that pages were no longer needed, and they would have been gone.
They said that it was really because it was too expensive and it had become anachronistic. And I think that both of those issues are real ones, and ones that we can address when rethinking what a new, modern, reformed program could look like. They didn't mention some of the potential of scandal that had happened and some of the liabilities and risks for those elected officials, but those are liabilities that can be assuaged as well.
I think that they are not serving our country well by not giving our young people the opportunity to see the government up close and to hopefully inspire more talented people to get into public service.
When we received word that the PAGE program had been cut, I don't know a single member of Congress who cheered. I don't know a single member of Congress who said good riddance. Only the people who came in after the PAGE program was discontinued would not understand or have appreciation for what these kids did. And frankly, if they did nothing but sat there all day, every day, watching the goings-on in the House of Representatives of the most powerful nation on the planet, that alone would have been significant.
Whatever arguments exist against or in favor of pages serving in the United States Capitol, one fact remains. This centuries-old tradition has allowed countless young people to serve their country and inspire them to become the leaders of tomorrow.
I suppose if there's one thing that the pages had in common is that they were all interested in making the country a better place. They were all interested in the future of the United States in the grandest possible sense.
This experience just changes you, and it gives you a whole different perspective on how the country is run.
It's an experience that has, for generations, enriched the lives of young men and women from every background in the country.
It's very important for members of Congress when they're passing laws that affect our future to see the next generation there. That's what pages are. They're representative of the next generation. And they're there with the eyes and ears of those people who will be most affected by the laws that you're passing.
Every single one of the pages that I was lucky to have all gone on to be very, very successful in life. And he said that experience changed them forever, and it gave them a confidence in themselves and a different perspective so that they could move forward and do things that they never dreamed of.
We're a democracy, and we need people in communities and institutions around our country who believe that government can work.
You feel like you're part of history, and you know that this is a program that's been around for 200 years since the inception of the House. And it's pretty cool to have been a name on that list. And it makes you feel like you put your mark on history in a very small way. And it's, I think, for a 16-year-old, very powerful.
I'm coming.
Well, I want to thank you all for joining us here today, and I just want to acknowledge there are a fair number of people who were interviewed and supported this film here that are in the audience, and I want to thank you all personally for participating. It's been a labor of love, a long time, but I think we made our point. So we have a number of former House pages here with us today who were in the film in one form or another, and we thought it would be a good time to ask them a few questions beyond what you heard in the film. To my immediate right is Frank Mitchel. Frank was the first modern-day African-American House page appointed in 1965. Later had a career in journalism communications, and currently lives in Houston, Texas. To his right, Camilla Bosanquet, a 1990-91 House page, a U.S. Coast Guard commander, having served on active duty for more than 2 decades. Camilla, thanks for joining us. And Finally, Professor Jonathan Turley, nationally recognized legal scholar, professor of George Washington Law School, a 1979 House page. Frank, I'm going to start with you. You were appointed the first modern-day African-American page in 1965 by Congressman Paul Findley of Springfield, Illinois, on the 100th anniversary of the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. While an African-American had been appointed in the Supreme Court in 1954, it was still quite a historic occasion in 1965 at your appointment. You want to tell us a little bit about your experience those first few days and weeks on Capitol Hill?
Well, as one of the pages indicated in the film, it wasn't usually, I went a different route than most. Usually they wrote their congressman and kept requesting an appointment. They wanted to be a page. They kind of came to me. They called on Saturday and said, on Sunday, you need to go down to Mr. Finley's office and meet with some people to talk about becoming a page in the House of Representatives. They selected myself and 4 other black students at the predominantly black high school in Springfield, Illinois. I always feel obligated to mention their names: Tom Carswell, now Dr. Tom Carswell, the late Rufus Adams, Robert Hearn, and Jesse Howard. They all would have done well. But what they told me on Sunday when they called and said I had been selected was, you need to be in Washington by Wednesday. Right. So Monday and Tuesday was checking out of my high school, getting any paperwork I need to get in order to get a haircut, buy some clothes, a new suit or two. It was pretty hectic. And then when I got to Washington, it was my first plane ride, which was a little harrowing, especially coming in over Potomac and the water and all that. Are we landing in the water? Is the first question you think of. But when I get there and we go to lunch, and then we have a press conference, I meet Paul Finley, Les Aarons, and Gerald Ford. And afterwards, after the press conference, everything kind of disappears. So we're sitting around all afternoon, all part into the evening, and I'm wondering what's going on. And what really was going on was they were trying to figure out where I was going to stay. So they found a cousin, bless his heart, Don Jackson, and his wife Maggie, and their son, 2-year-old Barry, who knew he had a brother or sister coming because Maggie was 8 months pregnant. And so when I showed up, he thought I was the new baby. So it was a different entree into the page program.
Camilla, you were appointed by Representative Charlie Wilson of Texas, probably most famously known and depicted in the film Charlie Wilson's War, about his efforts to boost funding for Afghan freedom fighters in the war against the invading Soviets. Tell us, what was it like to be Charlie Wilson's page, and did that have an impact on your decision to join the Coast Guard?
Thank you, Jerry. Yes, well, he was larger-than-life character. He was a real personality. People would say derogatory things about him all the time, to which he would typically respond, you know, not all of those statements are compliments, right? So he was very funny. He was a quintessential politician. He was super tall, and he would take up the whole doorway when he would come into the front office or his staff's office from his own. He was very nice to me, very polite. I was a little bit intimidated by him because he was such a big personality. But I remember being ushered in toward the end of my page year to see him. And I had the opportunity to ask him about the fact that he had graduated from the Naval Academy. I was interested in prospectively serving in the military. I was 17 at the time. And I asked him what he thought about that. So here here's this old school guy who's kind of a playboy by reputation. I mean, he was always appropriate with me. But I went in to talk to him, and he, first of all, he completely encouraged me, which was great. And then I mentioned, there's this summer program at the Naval Academy. Do you think you can... Do you think you could say a good word or write me a recommendation letter? And he goes, I'll do better than that, Cammy darling. And he picks up the phone and he speed dials the superintendent of the Naval Academy. And he says, hey, I've got a young person here who wants to come to your summer program before her senior year of high school. Can you get a spot? And I went, and can you get 5 more? I've got some friends who want to come. So, yeah, he got all 5 spots. Actually, a couple of those folks, or 6 spots, right? And a couple of those folks went on to West Point Naval Academy. I went to the Coast Guard Academy. And of course, I've served all these many years. And, before I left his office that day, he pulled me aside and said, that I needed to always remember that he might have started in the Navy, but then, of course, he served in the Texas House and the Texas Senate, and then he went on to serve, I think, 12 terms in Congress. And he said quite pointedly that he saw his time in the military as just a foundation for a lifetime of service, and that he expected me to follow in his footsteps. So I really very much appreciated that.
Thank you. Jonathan, well, first of all, as producer of this, I sat through many of the full interviews of all the panels here and everyone that was interviewed for this. And I will say one story, and I'm going to ask Jonathan to speak on it, that I regretted not including in the film, was Jonathan's interaction with Congresswoman Barbara Jordan. And so, John, why don't we start with that? We thought that we'd start the interaction with our pages, with our members of Congress first, and always kind of start the panel. So,
well, I began as a page in 1978. Alex Treadway is here, was there as well, looking younger than he should. And I worked under Don Anderson and became a House leadership page. To do that, you had to go through that grueling thing of memorizing every face, every party, the chairman of the committees, and somehow Don Anderson and Mr. Oliver, who's also here today, somehow got kids to be able to do that, teenagers on top of it. But for me, there was really only one reason I wanted to be a House page, and that is I wanted to work with Barbara Jordan, who was my longtime hero. And I thought if I became a House page, we all have members that would come to you, and mine would be Barbara Jordan. I was a Democratic House page. And so the day came, I was made a House leadership page and a cloakroom page. And I spotted her. And I was a newly minted cloakroom page. And she was rather old at that point. She had a cane and not particularly stable. And she was going across the floor. And I first was waiting at this door, and then she made this sort of 180 and started to go out another door. So I ran out the door, ran around the House floor so that I could introduce myself. And I ran to the doors just as she was grabbing onto the handle, and I whipped it open and deposited Barbara Jordan across the floor as she grabbed the handle and just went sprawling in front of me as I stood there in absolute terror. And all I could say is, Congressman Jordan, I'm the new cloakroom page. If there's anything I could do for you, it would be an honor. And I looked up, and I believe Don Anderson, I think, was standing there looking at me like, you'll be gone by the morning. I wouldn't make that promise. So Don Anderson, being a kind individual, did not fire me. And so a week later, I was beside myself. I was shaking in shame and self-loathing. And then finally, I'm in one of those old elevators. This is a week later, and the old ones that didn't have those bumpers that back then they would just close. They didn't have any safety bumpers. And so I'm sitting there, and who is running for the elevator? It's Barbara Jordan on her cane. The doors are wide open. And I thought, here's my chance. And so she starts to go forward, and I reach to hold the door open, and I end up hitting the close door button just as she put her cane in, and the thing gets stuck on her cane. As she can't get it out, I can't get the doors open, and she looked through and she said, Jonathan, is that you? And I realized Barbara Jordan knows my name. And I said, it is, Congressman. Is there anything I could do for you? So I did succeed in getting Barbara Jordan to finally know my name.
Thank you. Well, and now that story is recorded for memory, so thank you. Frank, in the documentary, we have a number of people interviewed, many from underrepresented communities, who explained how their appointment as a page sent them on a life trajectory that they never would have experienced otherwise. What was your personal experience, and what are your thoughts on this, on the value of the PAGE program?
Well, the PAGE program certainly made a difference in my life. Everyone in Springfield that I knew then still calls me, introduces me. He's the first black page in the White House, So without going into a civics lesson, I, try to correct them. But for me, I think my parents, my grandparents, my environment meant I was going to be stubborn enough to get out of the environment I grew up in. But what the PAGE program did in working side by side with some pretty formidable people, I mean, Don Rumsfeld was a congressman then, Melvin Laird, who also was a defense secretary, Al Quie went on to be Minnesota governor, John Lindsay went on to be mayor of New York City. They were all part of the group of congressmen I served in the cloakroom, in the Republican cloakroom at the time. Well, yeah, he kind of did okay too. And what that taught me was, even though I was kind of a shy person at the time, was that I could deal with people and an assortment of people. The fact I was the only African American really didn't dawn on me or have an impact on me. It just kind of internalized for me that I could fit in anywhere. And so as I went on to be a journalist and then in public relations, I often was the only African American in the room, and it didn't faze me. I knew I'd be able to communicate what I needed to communicate with some degree of clarity and vigor, and so it helped. Right. It probably helped me get my first job as a journalist with my hometown newspaper, because I went in and applied for a job as a stock clerk and said, "Hey, I can write," and they knew me from being a page, and so they put me into their training program, and I did every job in the newsroom and went on from there.
Great. Thank you. Camilla, you were a page during the first Gulf War debate in the House of Representatives. You mentioned in the documentary that you felt that members of Congress would stare at you all on the bench, you and your colleagues, realizing that their vote on the war might impact your future. Do you feel that you and your young page colleagues' presence on the floor really did make a difference?
Yes, I do, absolutely. And for those of us who are here today who are pages, we all have our own stories of members stopping to talk with us, to ask us how we might vote if it were our responsibility, engaging us in the discussion, which was a national, any national discussion of import. There's something about having the teenagers right there on the House floor that's much more immediate than we all sort of acknowledge that many of these members of Congress, many of them have kids and grandkids and understand that what they're voting on has repercussions, not only for their own lives, but of course for their kids and grandkids. When they were looking at us, they were, I'm sure, thinking about whether or not the this particular conflict might be protracted, and whether or not there would be some or several or many of us who would go on to have to fight in a conflict they were voting for. And I think the same thing probably happens when they're voting on spending bills, when they're trying to pass a budget, when they're thinking about deficit spending. Just having those young people right there on the floor, engaging with them, talking to them every day, they're a visible reminder that this democracy of ours, that there's this, that the decisions that they make there in the House and in the Senate have lasting repercussions.
Jonathan, there's one line in one of many lines in the documentary, but I think my favorite early on in the documentary, you state that pages are as an important symbol of Congress as anything else in that building. You want to expand on your thoughts there?
Well, in many ways, the page system is living history. It's remarkable how, even though we have changed in terms of our outward appearance, if you look at those pictures, they all really do look a lot alike. It's that same look of awe, maybe a little bit of fear. But that's part of the living history of the Capitol. I remember when I was a leadership page, occasionally when the flag page was sick, you would be shanghaied into raising the flag in the morning, which was a task you were lucky to return from. Because back in the 70s, there was this little plank. It was sort of rotted out plank that you would actually walk this remarkably long distance to this flag. And it was, I remember, it might have been Treadway that took me up the first time, but I remember one of the pages saying, that thing's going to break any day. We just don't know which page is going to get it. And so you would walk on top of the Capitol on this precarious plank. And you'd often raise this flag as the sun was going up over Washington. And I remember as a page standing there the first time and just being overwhelmed by it all and feeling that I was part of this building, part of this institution. And when I came back, there was a wall that pages had written their name on. It was a sort of an odd way to get up to sort of this crawl space. And the pages' name were part of the building. You could feel the sense of it going back decades. And so they played a role. In many ways, they reminded members of the idealism that they had, perhaps past tense, perhaps a time for renewal, but they represented that. And in some ways, it shamed members. I remember one time that a member had been accused, a Democratic member, accused of impropriety, I think a very serious one. And the Republican whip at that time was named Bauman, spelled much like Bowman, and he was attacking this member who had just come in a pretty vicious way. And I was really shocked by it, because I really did respect these members, and I was shocked to see that type of language on the floor. And Perry Mitchel walked up, who was an African-American representative, I believe, from Maryland. He had done some acting in his time, and he could see I was upset. And he said, "Jonathan, what's wrong?" And I told him. And he just went, well, well, well. And he went out and came all the way around to come through the middle door, and he threw open the door and screamed, "Point of personal privilege." And this, he was a Shakespearean actor one time, and this point of personal privilege. And they yielded the floor to him, and Perry Mitchel went to the very front, to the well. And he says, "I look upon my colleague," whose name was spelled like Bowman, "and I think of a scene in King Lear where the king is told that the battle is going well, and this soldier leaves, but he knows it's not going quite as well as he imagines. And he says in his wake, 'Poor pitiful Bowman, dreaming dreams of success which will never be achieved. Poor, poor pitiful Bowman, the last of a dying breed.'" And he started to walk off the floor, and Bauman stood up and said, "I want the spelling of Bowman." And Mitchel turned around and said, "I mean he who slings bows and arrows," and left the floor. And I thought, okay, I feel better.
Thank you. I have one last question for all of you, and just a little open-ended. It's been now over 6 years since the House eliminated its page program, yet the Senate page still exists, continues to thrive, actually. Given all the political and social changes in society these past 6 years, do you believe there's still a place for a page program on Capitol Hill? Frank?
Yes.
Tell us more.
I mean, obviously, there's a value to it, an immeasurable value. I look at it as, I think Ellen said this one time on a panel we were on. It's like seeing sausage made up close. That's the way what the legislative process is. You can read about passing a bill or parliamentary procedure or what the whip does. You can read it in a book, but seeing it up close and personal, I remember Les Aarons would pull members into the cloakroom and not so much strong-arm them, but persuade them, they needed to support this or that piece of legislation. Understanding that what you're looking at is some sort of history being made. That will serve you later in life, whatever you do. Knowing how to count the votes when you need them, knowing how to plan to get the legislation you want passed, and it will help you whether you go on to become an elected official or not. Pages aren't there to be elected officials in training. They're going to learn so much they can apply it to any profession they go in. I think Bill Gates and some of the others in the film would testify to that.
Thank you. Actually, you mentioned in your responses there Ellen.
Yes.
And I wanted to find a chance, and I'm glad you brought her name up. I just wanted to acknowledge the recent passing of Ellen McConnell Blakeman. Ellen passed away last month. She, along with Paulette DeSalle and Julie Price, I think who's here someplace over here, were the first 3 female pages in the Senate. And the 3 of them fought that fight. Ellen maybe fought it maybe even longer, and passed away, served on our board and passed away just last month, and a big void in our lives. And she was the heart of our alumni association, I think a heart and a pioneer for the female pages along the way, and all of us. So I just wanted to acknowledge her recent passing, a big void in our lives. Camilla, I think you got the question, but let me, if they're, given all the political and social changes in society these past 6 years, do you believe that there's still a role for a page program on Capitol Hill?
Well, of course I'm biased, but I believe we should bring back the page program in the House. Absolutely. That needs to happen. The movie does a very nice job of talking about the relatively recent closure of the House program. But I can't help but think it's not unlike the Me Too movement and everything that's, you mentioned, everything that's going on in society today. Why are we blaming the pages rather than holding people accountable to appropriate standards of conduct? That's what needs to happen. And it's true, everything that we said here. The pages are eyewitnesses to history, just sitting feet away. I had the unique privilege, as some of us did, of serving as the documentarian page, and I sat right up next to the speaker. It was amazing. I sat feet away from the president giving the State of the Union address. It was extraordinary for a young person to have that kind of vantage point. But since we're telling stories, I've got a good one for you. I'll tell you about behavior of a member. And there was one night when Congress was trying to, I think they were trying to pass the budget. I mean, imagine that, going late until the night trying to pass the budget. And Speaker of the House Tom Foley came in, and the room was packed. The chamber was packed. He came in to make a few remarks, and the only way I can describe the way he looked like a candle that had melted. The poor guy. It was probably, 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. He just looked so tired. And while he was giving his remarks, here was a member on the documentarian desk was on the Republican side, and Silvio Conti, who used to drive a little scooter around, and he had a bunch of flags, an American flag. He'd try to run down the pages. It was fantastic. And people were afraid of him. But he climbed into his chair on the aisle, and he started coughing really loudly. And it didn't occur to me, or maybe it did, I don't know. I don't think it occurred to me that he was trying to be disruptive. He really was. And he was trying to interrupt the Speaker of the House's remarks. And so I snuck back into the Republican cloakroom because that was the easiest vantage point. And I asked Peggy if she had a couple of throat lozenges, maybe some Kleenex, and a bottle of water.
That was Peggy Sampson. I'm sorry.
Yes, Peggy Sampson.
Okay.
And she was the Republican page director over in the Republican cloakroom. And so she gave me the stuff, the gear, and I went up to Congressman Conti and I said, "Sir, you seem to be coughing a lot, and here you might need this." And the look on his face, at first it was just, "I can't believe you're handing me this stuff. What is going on?" And then he burst out laughing. It was fantastic. And from then on, every time he would come on the House floor, he would motion me over and introduce me to the other congressmen. And it was, so talk about holding these members to good conduct. I think it was good to have the pages in the room.
Great. Thanks, Camilla. Jonathan, given all the political and social changes in society the last 6 years, do you believe there's a place for the PAGE program in Capitol Hill?
Well, I clearly do. But I differ a little bit in the sense that I really don't believe that these teenagers need Congress. I do think Congress needs these teenagers. They play a very important role in reminding these members that they are creating a debt that will be paid by a next generation. But they're also a symbol to all the young people to see them, that you're invested in the system, you're part of it. They represent those people. And the members understand that. When the House program was killed, very few members were ever even informed. It was done basically at midnight. And with no thought, no debate, they killed one of the longest and one of our few really long traditions in this country. But the members actually do get it. I remember when Hubert Humphrey was speaking on the floor, Congressman Patton came by and said, "Jonathan, come and sit next to me." And I said, "We can't do that. Mr. Anderson will kill me." And he goes, "The speech isn't about us, it's about you. You sit down next to me." And I sat down next to him, and afterwards he pushed me forward and he said to Humphrey, he said, "Hubert, you have to meet somebody important." And Hubert Humphrey turned around and he pushed me forward, and I was speechless because I really adored Hubert Humphrey. And Humphrey put his hand on my shoulder and says, "Jonathan, I want you to think about what you want to say because I have some things I want to say to you. And you come to my office and we'll have a talk." And that was in November, and he died in January, the day before we were supposed to meet. And I ended up walking from Georgetown, where I was enjoying one of those implausible fake IDs. And I walked all the way from Georgetown and ended up on the stairs of the Supreme Court. And I was bawling my eyes out, just out of control. And this Capitol policeman came up, and he asked what was wrong, and I told him. And he said, "You stay here as long as you want, son." And the fact is, we've been there at history, throughout history. And it touches us in a way that is unique. The fact that we're not there in the people's house is one of the greatest scandals of my lifetime. I will never understand it, but we need to reverse it and bring the tradition back, in my view.
If I could piggyback on your Hubert Humphrey story, when I was appointed in 1965 there was a lot of fanfare. Pictures in Ebony and Jet, Time, Newsweek, Sun-Times, Tribune, everybody, Washington Post, LA Times, New York Times, that and 50 Cent will get you whatever. But Hubert Humphrey, Senator Hubert Humphrey, at the time, Vice President Hubert Humphrey sent me a note with a clipping from his home, from the Minneapolis Star, and with some nice words on it. So I called the office and said, may I come over and meet him and get a picture? I was into my PR thing at a young age. So I went over and I met him. I've got a picture with him shaking hands. That was 1965. In 1972, I took a job at WCCO TV in Minneapolis as a reporter and became the political reporter covering City Hall, then the legislature, then the congressional delegation. I reconnected with then Senator Humphrey, flew on his plane, covering farm issues and different things. But the sad part, and the reason I know how you felt, I had to break the story that he had inoperable cancer. And I remember when he went back to the Senate, and it was right after Jimmy Carter, I think, had been elected. And shortly after that, he died. So I remember those days well.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have time for some questions. So we have mics on either side. I encourage you, now's your chance to ask some questions of our panelists or me. And I ask you to please go to the side and use the mics here. So while we have one coming, if you have some ideas, please get your thoughts together and move to either side, and you can use the mics for the questions.
Hi, I'm Jan
Sir.
Schoonmaker. What's going to be the availability of the film for distribution or purchase? There are a lot of people that aren't able to be here today that I know would have liked to have been here and do want to see the film.
Well, the good news is, thanks to the National Archives, the film and the panel will be on their website, available at some point after today for a long time. So that they'll be able to see the panel. The film itself as a DVD will be available later this month. And those of
Amazon
you
or?
I'm sorry?
Through Amazon or what?
We initially through our page website, and we'll have other distribution.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the film and the stories today. As young people learning about politics, and as it was mentioned in a movie about two parties, how did being a page take you in a direction of whether you believe a Democrat or Republican would be something you would follow in your own political beliefs?
Is this directed to anyone in any particular?
Anyone or all.
Okay. Anyone want to volunteer to answer that, or I'll Frank?
Well, I think the important thing for any American is to evolve with the issues. Don't lock yourself in because you're a Democrat or a Republican. Conservatism, liberalism, all those things are redefining themselves as we go. My best example of that is the man who nominated me, Paul Finley, in 2008. He invited me to attend a speech he was giving at Illinois College on the only congressional term of Abraham Lincoln. So I drive over to Jacksonville, walk in his house. His wife Lucille is watching CNN, and she's just mad at the TV because they're talking about this young senator from Illinois who's running for president, Barack Obama. These are lifelong Republicans, and they had a sign in their yard, Obama for president. Now, that to me is evolution.
The thing that surprised me the most was realizing that we could even appreciate the folks who were on the extremes, because they drove some of the discussion. There were certainly some larger-than-life personalities that we knew about before we showed up as pages. To watch them in action and to see them stimulate some of the discussion, I thought was really interesting. But when I was a page, I remember the members having lunch together across the aisle, working across the aisle. And I don't know if perhaps, having young people, again, I'm very biased on this point, but having young people in the House chamber might have encouraged a kind of civility, encouraged a kind of decorum that led to those kind of, that kind of cooperative behavior. But I would like to think so.
Johnson, do you want?
I think one thing that I've always found common among former pages is a real sense of idealism. It's not that we're chumps. We've seen really bad go to worse in Congress. But if you ask former pages, they all have this really undying faith in the system that transcends the parties. I do think Congress has changed a bit. I think it's nastier. We have former Congressman Davis is here. I'm going to embarrass him by pointing him out. And he's a great supporter of the page system. Maybe this is my idealism, but I was there during the O'Neill period. And I remember I came back, one of my roles was to be lead counsel in the last impeachment trial, which was for Judge Porteous, and that was in the Senate. And so holding a trial on the Senate floor was a very odd thing. But the Senate pages found out I was a former page. And they came over and they said, "Is it true you're a former page?" And I said, "Yeah, I was a House page. Does that matter?" And one of them says, "No, a page is a page." And by the way, I got anything I needed through that trial. I felt sorry for the House of Representative members who were there on the prosecution side. But there was a poignant moment. I hope that I'm not betraying anything from the late Senator Inouye. But I adored Inouye. He was a graduate of GW where I teach. And during one of the breaks in the trial, he came over, and he was always very encouraging, and he said, "I think things are going well," which I have to tell you, since my guy had been impeached basically by a unanimous vote of the House, it was not really going that well. So he said, "I think you're doing great, and I think things are going well." And he says, "What is it like to argue this case on the Senate floor?" And he said, I feel like I'm back being a page again, but it's different." He says, "I remember coming over here when there was Hubert Humphrey and Moynihan, and they were giants, and it just seems like they're a lot smaller now." And Inouye got very quiet, and he said, "They are." He said, "I think about that every time I walk onto the floor." And so I do think that Congress has changed a bit, and I agree. It's not that we caused it because of our absence, but pages really do play an important role for these members. It does remind them of why they first came there. And that's why we need it back in the House.
Thank you.
I'd like to add, Camilla, to what you just said. I think, I don't know if I had a Barbara Jordan moment, but when I first was appointed a page, I was in the House Republican cloakroom, and one of my idols back then was Shirley Chisholm. Oh, yeah. 1971. And I remember, she's just an icon back then, and I was working in the cloakroom, and we were always a little protective of the cloakroom. And I remember Ms. Chisholm walking up to the cloakroom, and I was the person at the door there, and I asked Ms. Chisholm, and actually I didn't block her way, but she walked right in. She was looking. She asked me where I think Congressman Smith from New York was, and I knew he was in the back, way around the back, and I don't think she wanted to go all the way around the back, but she felt very comfortable enough to walk into the cloakroom. I remember other members of Congress saying, "Hi, Shirley, how are you doing?" And and I remember getting Mr. Smith and and they were talking as a New York issue. So she was Brooklyn, he was upstate New York, and they were chatting about whatever the common issue was. I don't think that would ever happen today again. I think walking into the other side's cloakroom, someone would have a camera, and there would be a primary opponent on either side, right or left. And I think that's really, it's sad that we're missing that now. I remember how, even though we were little, we were Republicans, but they talked to each other. And they got along, and they worked together. They were still partisan, but they worked together. So you've been waiting a long time, so please.
Good afternoon. My name's Gregory King. I was a Senate page from 1970 to 1973, and I think I'm one of the few pages who's lucky enough to say that I had 3 siblings who followed me as members of the Page Corps, including my sister Ottilie, who is here today. But I wanted to ask a question about our high school. We went to perhaps one of the smallest and most unique high schools in America. And I'd be curious if you had any recollections of favorite teachers or favorite moments while you were students in school.
Well, Mrs. Miranda's right here.
I think she had to leave, actually.
She was right here
her, yeah.
just a moment ago. I remember the teachers being just wonderful. They were so invested in us, and in particular, and of course, I was on the House side, so the school was split in half when I attended Page School. We had the private House Page School, and then we had the D.C. Public School for the Senate pages. So we would go to the Library of Congress and go up into the attic, and we would split up for classes. But one of the things that I remember most particularly were the weekend trips. We would have the D.C. experience, and for several weeks in advance of this D.C. experience, like, for example, going to visit college, so UVA, and then we would go to Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. And in the lead up to these visits, we would learn all about the history and the politics and the architecture and the art. And it was just truly, it was like a gifted and talented program on steroids. To be in the company of these students who came from all over the country, who were interested in politics like I was, who were smart. Smart doesn't even start to explain how some of my classmates were. I've got 2 of them who are here today. They're amazing people. They were interested. I shared with Jerry before we started the program today that it boggles my mind that people can't wrap their heads around the fact that in some respects this is a scholarship program. It's an investment. It's an investment in a group of young people who go on and do remarkable, extraordinary things for this country. It's an investment in ourselves, in our country. So again, I will beat the drum again, bring back the Page program, but I do believe that it's not unlike, say, a Fulbright program where you're choosing from among the best and the brightest who go on to have these remarkable futures and careers.
I'd like to give one shout out to one teacher, and that is Naomi Omer. When I became a leadership page, leadership pages had bad reputations. We would show up at 6 and just sleep at our desks, and we were told that there was nothing we could do that would get us expelled, and so we were horrible little children. And I took Almy's anthropology class, and I did this paper, and it came back with an F. And I was shocked. I'd never seen that letter on a paper in my life. And I was just shaking, went to her, and I said, I can't believe that this is an F. I worked on this. And she said, it's not an F. It's a B. I said, but there's an F on it. She says, oh, yeah, I gave you an F because you should do better than a B. And I said, wait, that's not fair. And she said, it's not fair. But you should be doing better than B work. And so you get an F. And so she said, now you have the rest of the term to make up your grade. And I went to the Library of Congress and worked my tail off to get that grade up to an A. And she ultimately said, you have an A, and by the way, here. And I said, what's this? And she said, this is your next job. You're going to go to the Environmental Institute at the Smithsonian at the Chesapeake Bay. I applied for you, and you've been accepted. And I kept up with Naomi Omer, who's one of the most influential people in my life. And that, I think, is what the Page School was all about, was Naomi Omer.
I got to say, there were a number of us who, I was in Capitol Page School when Greg was there as well, and there were a set of teachers that had been there for probably a couple decades, probably the 50s, 60s, 70s, and I'm glad to know that Naomi was still there, because we did include her in the film. I don't know if you saw that, a brief moment. There was a film done in the mid-50s about the Capitol Page School, and we have a little tip to Naomi in that, because I know she did impact a lot of our lives, and some of the other teachers as well. Fred Hilton, some of the other ones were amazing teachers. So, Beth?
Yes, I have a question. I'm Beth Ambrose. I was a cloakroom page in 1991. My question is directed at Professor Turley. I had the privilege of going to our very first all-class homecoming several years ago, and you gave the keynote address. And I wish to God that every member of Congress could have heard that address, because it was magnificent as far as proving what the Page program meant to you, to all of us, in a very, very eloquent way. My question is, have you thought of how we might go about bringing the House program back, and what your role might be in it, since you, in my opinion, are the best at putting it, why we should bring it back?
Thank you. This is not a plant. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. Jerry and others have been working very, very hard on bringing the House system back. I have to say, I was so livid about not only that the House program had ended, but how it was ended, that I found myself incapable of speaking to some of the members that I'd worked with most of my life on. But we have a Page Corps that is large and loyal, and we're ready to work hard to bring back the program. And I think we can. Now, it's true that this, Nancy Pelosi's office played a big role, I think, in the removal of the system. But people and things change, and I think we have to reapproach them as we have. And I think we have to remind them that when they talk about the next generation, they shouldn't be shooting a program that was about the next generation. And we need to show them films like this about what this meant, not just for Pages, but what Pages meant for history. We have a good argument to make. We have a good case to present. And I think if we get together and we use all of our assets, we can bring the House system back.
Thank you. And on that positive note, I want to thank our panelists, Frank Mitchel, Camilla Bosanquet, and Jonathan Turley. And thank you all for coming today. Thank you to the National Archives for showing our film here and this panel. We'll see you next time. Thank you.